Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the summit. We have another amazing masterclass session here. We have another of our friends and another amazing guest, Alex Hamerstone from the TrustedSec team. TrustedSec is a very respected cybersecurity consulting firm. Most people in the industry have heard of them and know about them. They speak all over the country, and they have some amazing teammates. And we're honored to have Alex with us today. And Alex is going to talk about setting up security programs that help your organization with their privacy and compliance programs as well.
Right.
So welcome, Alex, to the summit today, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much.
So if you don't mind, can we just preface with you and what you do?
Absolutely. So I work on the advisory team over here at TrustedSec. I've been with the company a little over 6 years. We're working the GRC part. Prior to this, I worked at a software company in a security and compliance role. And before that, I was at a different security consulting company. So I've been doing this for quite a while now. I work with all kinds of companies, everything from sole proprietorships all the way to the Fortune 10. I work to assess and build information security programs, whether based on best practices or build them to standards or whatever it may be. But I work a lot more on the business side of the security program than I do on the technical side.
Well, from listening to the TrustedSec podcast, it's definitely obvious that you have a lot of boots on the ground experience to listen to your insights and opinions on things.
Well, appreciate that. But yeah, I always say I'm not smarter than anybody else. I've just seen a lot of different environments and see what works, what doesn't. So I usually have a pretty decent insight. So if someone's researching something, it's likely that I've already talked to someone that's already researched it, or I spend some time doing that myself. So when I have the answer, it's usually because of that.
Well, we're excited to have you here talking about building security and compliance programs. That's very important for the CCPA topic.
Right. Appreciate your time.
Appreciate you having me. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, perfect. So I was asked to talk a little bit about privacy in the context of security programs. And one of the things that we'll get into a little bit is, how compliance is not security, and they're very different, but privacy is a whole other thing as well. And while they're all related and have a lot of crossover, they're not the same thing. So a little bit about myself. Again, I've been with TrustedSec for quite a while now. I work with all different size companies. I give a lot of presentations. I'm very fortunate to do that. I've been able to publish a few different things. Spend a lot of time doing media appearances, which people always ask about. It means I know what color makeup I wear. So if you ever want to know that, I have the answer there. Do that quite a lot. We really enjoy doing that because it allows us to kind of bring the cybersecurity message to kind of the greater population out there. So in my background, as I said before, I assess and help build information security programs. Work on building risk-based security programs, work on multiple different standards, whether it's HIPAA or PCI or the CSF or a lot of the other things out there. Spend a lot of time with those. I spend a lot of time with documentation, both writing and assessing it. And our client base, is everything from sole proprietorships all the way up to the largest companies on earth around the world. So to start off, one thing that's most interesting to me about the CCPA is that it's been similar in the lead up to what happened with GDPR. And a quick story was about 6 months before GDPR came into effect, I was asked to give a presentation to a group of CIOs about GDPR. And what was most interesting to me is that almost every one of them during the question session, which went on for a very long time, they were telling me that they'd been to tons of presentations about GDPR and that they'd heard so many different conflicting things, and that they'd heard just ridiculous statements and things that turned out not to be true, and that everybody had all these great ideas or these big ideas of what was going to happen, and people really just didn't have a lot of an idea. And a lot of the people that were sharing their views and opinions on GDPR, running around the country doing these presentations in the US were not very well versed in it, and were giving out a lot of misinformation. So I'm very big on, especially with anything that has legal implications, is be sure to consult counsel. I mean, these are legal issues, and privacy, has a lot of legal ramifications. So make sure that you're consulting the experts, and make sure that you're putting together a plan for how you're going to meet these requirements. They can have very large effects on an organization. One of the things that we always discuss in this industry is compliance versus security. And people love to say compliance is not security and security is not compliance. I've had multiple friends, people that I respect, that will even say that, if you're secure, you're going to end up being compliant. To me, that couldn't be further from the truth. The reason being that so much compliance deals with documentation.
Right.
Even if you're the most secure program in the world, if you're not documenting it properly and things like that, you're not going to be in compliance. And vice versa, with compliance, it can be multiple different ways that people meet it. And oftentimes the spirit is there. So if somebody is really following the spirit of the compliance standard and what it's designed to do, oftentimes they'll end up with a pretty good security program. But the fact of the matter is, oftentimes people are just looking for that check mark. And so they're not necessarily looking for how can I become secure or follow the spirit. They're looking for how can I get that check mark. Another point is, because this is really a privacy conversation, the compliance and security debate is, a little bit different. Privacy is something that, over the past couple of years, even before GDPR or the CCPA or some other things, you've heard a lot more about it. It's something that people talk a lot more about. And it's something that, has really come to the forefront and something that people are discussing much more often in the information security business.
And then just to add to what you said, when the auditors or the attorney general, whoever's coming in to investigate, they're going to see, they care about your security, but they care about, can you show me that you're doing it, is what they care about.
And how you're demonstrating it, absolutely. And so, one of the things that you'll often hear Dave say, or that we talk about a lot, is that, over our careers, things have changed significantly. And it used to be that, you build walls around your data, you build walls around your systems and try to keep people out. But now everybody wants data everywhere. And you start to think about all the products that we use and things that we use every day, and how data has become so commoditized, and it really is everywhere. You look at, you go to buy a TV, they're much cheaper than you would think they would be because they're subsidized by your data, and things like that. And data is extremely valuable, and it's really just being shared all the time in all different kinds of contexts and used in lots of different ways. So it's really changed our careers, and our focus and the different things from looking at how you build walls to how you can, have holes in those walls and be able to share things appropriately, and how you can use data the correct way. So again, being prepared is probably the most important thing, and something that I think people don't necessarily spend enough time on, with things that are coming up. And you oftentimes see people wait until the last minute, or they'll get close to a deadline and then decide they need to have a security program or a privacy program or whatever it is. But one of the things I always preach is, whether it's the CCPA or whether it's other standards or things like that, is that if you're following a lot of the security fundamentals that you need to be following anyway, or really should be following anyway, it's going to set you up really well. It's not going to make you compliant, absolutely, but it can certainly set you up and make the road to compliance much easier. When you think about it, having system and software inventories, something that a lot of places don't necessarily do well, but having those really is going to make it easier. It's going to make it far easier to understand, what you have and how you need to protect it and how you need to secure it and things like that. Also, with really understanding your data, so having things like data inventories and data maps and data flows. So really just knowing what you have and where it is and who's using it and how they're using it and all these things that really we would hope you would know anyway as an organization. But these are the things that if you have those and understand them, it's going to make complying with any of these standards or regulations much easier. Also making sure that you're controlling access. So understanding who's accessing what and why and how and for how long, and how you revoke access and all those things. And then also how you're managing vulnerabilities, and whether you're looking at that from a patching standpoint or just other environmental or system vulnerabilities, and making sure that you have that security program in place, is going to go a long way, towards helping you be ready for these things. It's really challenging, really impossible to do security well without knowing what you have and where it is. When you start to think about it, you oftentimes see people that will take controls or try to put controls in place without understanding how they're affecting the environment, why they're putting them in place. They're layering controls on top of each other, maybe not in the right spots, maybe not in the most effective spots. And it's the same thing with privacy. If you don't know what you have, if you don't know how that data is being used, it's really impossible to do well and put together a program and have the right things in place. So it's very important, whether it's in security or in privacy, to make sure that you really understand what you have and how it's being used. Another thing that's really important, in the information security business, one of the things that we always like to think is that, we're supposed to know everything. And I remember, years ago when we started out in this industry, it was possible to have a pretty good, knowledge in a lot of different domains and pretty deep knowledge. But things have changed so rapidly, and there's so many things to know now, and so many different domains and disciplines. And it's okay to not be a privacy expert. If you're in security or if you're in something else. And so just make sure that you're seeking out the right people, the people with experience, people that deal with this every day to ask questions. That's something that's very important. There are a lot of resources out there, a lot of things that you can attend, a lot of places that you can go to gain more knowledge. So it's very important, to kind of make sure that we, understand our abilities and what we can do and what we can't do. For me, when it comes to privacy, I tend to work with a lot of attorneys and other people in that space. Will then ask me technical questions, or we'll talk about technical implementations and things like that. But really just remember that these really are legal issues and things that, you really need to seek expertise on and really make sure, that you're determining, what you're following and how to do it in that way. So again, when you're starting out the program or going down this path, it's really understanding what data do you actually have. And as I travel the world and talk to different people and different organizations and different things, nothing ever surprises me anymore. That's just the way it is. You see a lot of really amazing programs. You see some, with a lot of areas for improvement and whatever else. But really, understanding what data you actually have is a surprisingly difficult question for a lot of organizations, both large and small. There's certainly small organizations that don't necessarily, understand what they've actually gathered. There are large ones that have so much or historical data or who knows what it is, and it's flowing around the organization and being shared with third parties or whatever else it is. But also really understanding what data is in scope. And from a security perspective, of course, you want to protect all the data. But from a compliance perspective, when you're putting in place specific compliance controls, making sure that you understand what data is in scope and what you need to be doing, that's essential. Getting a really good understanding of where is the data. Because again, especially now, you can think about how you can create data. Really a Command C and a Command V, you can double your data locations, right? You can move it around, move it to the cloud, move it offsite, email it, whatever the ways are that data moves around. But it's really understanding where it is, and not just within your own environment, but with whom you're sharing it. So not just your third parties, your fourth parties, where is it? How are you using the data? Because there's a lot of things that we need to make sure that we understand about that, and how you're processing it and how you're using it, what you're doing with it, how you're storing it, etc. And then of course, who are you sharing this data with? You read about a lot of the issues in the newspaper. If you think of, maybe the top, the last 5 large news stories about breaches, and you start to think about them and drill down into them, a large percentage have been through third parties. And when you think about these breaches, you can certainly name the company that was affected, the largest, household name company, but nobody can name that third party that was actually breached that led to the issue. So it's very important to really understand those third party relationships. Another issue is, how do you demonstrate compliance? That's something that's extremely important, whether it's during an audit or an assessment or a legal action or whatever it may be. Can you demonstrate, how you're handling something like an opt-out? Can you prove a negative? Can you prove that you didn't share data? It's certainly possible to go back and look and see if somebody did something, but it can be really tough to prove that somebody didn't do something. And so to think about, how would you demonstrate that if you had to? Do you have a privacy policy? Is it something that you can hold in your hand? Is it something that people can read? Is it something that's shared appropriately? Do you have a documented breach plan? So, what are you going to do in the event of a breach? Is that documented? Has it been tested? The testing is so important. That's something that we see, fairly often, in our industry, is that, even when a plan is in place or has been built, it hasn't been tested. And so when it's time to actually use that, it may not work well or at all. And then do you have procedures in place, for information requests, access requests or deletion requests? So what do you do if you receive one of those? What's the mechanism look like to receive that? Make sure it receives action and that action is documented.
So if you don't mind, real quick, when it comes to some of those technical side, demonstrating, say, the opt-out or those types of things, what are some of the ways you've seen effective for handling that? Using your logs, using actual documentation through tickets? What are your thoughts?
So those are both ways that you see it. But the biggest challenge, again, not to kind of walk around the question, is that organizations oftentimes have challenges demonstrating where their data actually is. So they may be able to show you, what happened to one instance of that data,
Right.
but they may not know where else in the environment it is, and that's what makes it extremely difficult to demonstrate.
I guess that's where your data mapping and inventory comes into
Right.
place, which we have a whole nother episode on that, just how to find your data. But I guess that's where that becomes important.
And that's one I will definitely watch, because that's so important and so important to understand. But really, I really push assessments. Whether it's with a third party or if you're doing it yourself. You have to understand what you have and how things work. You have to test things. Having controls in place is one thing, but the fact that those controls work is different, because the existence of a control and the effectiveness of a control are very different. Especially when you're looking at compliance and documentation and things like that. And in what ways are you assessing your controls? How are you testing them? How are you auditing? How are you making sure that you have the things in place that you need to, for the program? How are you making sure that you're remediating vulnerabilities and making sure that, you're building your security program in the right way? And then how do you, on an ongoing basis, improve your program? And you'll note that a lot of these themes are things that are true for both a security program or a privacy program, or for both, or for a combination of the two. And really just making sure that, through testing, if you're discovering things that, need to be done differently, or through an actual event, making sure that you're going back and changing the program, changing the way things are done in the future to make sure that whatever, happened that was negative isn't going to happen again. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is, I see a lot of programs, both from an audit and assessment standpoint, and a lot of very shiny, very nice looking programs, very well documented programs, things with the greatest new tools, and full procedures. They don't necessarily work well in the real world. And there's a number of reasons why. Again, it all goes back to that data mapping or understanding what you have. But if the program that you have is not acting on the data that it needs to, then it's certainly not effective. If it's not covering everything that it needs to cover. And then just certain things that don't work. I know with GDPR, going back to that, talking to a number of organizations, or people that I know would tell me that, they had a program in place and they had all the documentation in place and they had the processes in place and everything was, beautiful documentation wise. But when it came time to actually receive a request, or if they got a request for something, they didn't know where the data was. So even though they had these processes that existed to be able to, act on that data, they couldn't because they didn't know where it was. And they weren't able to demonstrate that they'd followed the process. So again, it's very important to make sure that whatever you have in place is designed to be effective and that it's actually tested and that it actually works. When you think back to the old days, with small businesses, when they would do a backup and just take the tape home. I remember hearing a story of somebody that, said for years, the IT person would back up the data every Friday, take it home, store it under their bed or whatever it was, and did that dutifully. But when they finally lost their systems and had to go restore that backup, it didn't work.
Right.
So they've been doing what seemed like the right thing for years, but it didn't actually work. So it's very important to make sure that just because you have a process in place, that does not mean that the process is effective or that it actually works as intended. So it's very important to make sure that you're testing these things.
And then with your documentation, another issue we see sometimes, we work on more of the SME spectrum of organizations. The issue we see is the documentation or the demonstration documents are stored on somebody's laptop. And then when they leave the company, a new person comes in, they have no idea where everything is.
Right. Or that, or even, in a disaster recovery or business continuity situation,
right?
All the things that they needed were stored in a place that was part of the incident or the disaster.
Right.
So think about things like that. So it's extremely important to make sure that, these systems that you have are effective and in place. And then another thing, and something that's very important to remember, in this day and age, there are lots of tools out there. There are lots of things that are sold as silver bullets. Is to remember that even the best tools, if you have the most effective tool in the world, isn't going to help you if it's not used appropriately. So usually, on this slide, I use an image of a treadmill, but I wasn't able to find a good one that was royalty free. So I just used the clip art of the dumbbell. But I usually use an image of a treadmill, and I kind of joke about, that I don't use that because information security, feels like a treadmill that you kind of run on until, you retire or die. But, really that if I go out today and I buy the world's best treadmill or the world's best whatever piece of exercise equipment, and I go home and I put it in front of my TV in my living room or wherever I put it, am I suddenly in shape? And the answer is no, right? So having the right tool doesn't matter if you don't use it effectively. It has to be used as part of a program, and something that's so important to remember. Especially as you see all these, things out there that can be very helpful if used effectively. Some that maybe aren't helpful regardless. But making sure that we really understand, the capabilities of what we have and are using them effectively. Especially with any kind of, new thing that's coming out, just making sure that we're doing our research and really just making sure that we understand what it's designed to do and what it's actually able to do in our environment. So with that, I would like to take any questions that you may have and provide any, insight that maybe that I'm able to based on my experience.
You went through a lot of, I would say, thought-provoking questions or questions that people need to, or organizations need to ask themselves. What do you recommend an organization? Where do they need to get started? What should they do to even get started? They say, hey, you went through your questions. You called me on the carpet. I'm not there. What should I do to get started?
So the first thing is to understand the requirements. So understand, what the act actually says, and what it requires, what data is in scope, and then again to just understand. The first thing you have to do, that I always preach, is you have to understand what you actually have and what data you have, because really, in my view, any good assessment starts with understanding the environment. It starts with understanding the organization, because without that, it's impossible to have context. And any security controller or anything without context, it's really hard to measure it. You might have a certain procedure or a certain tool that in a vacuum is great, but in a certain environment it doesn't matter, because you don't have that data. So really, the first step, in my view, is always understanding what you have and what regulations or what controls should be applied to that.
Right.
That's the most important thing.
And along those lines, as far as what you have and what you could be in violation of, because of the way you have that data, or you're not protecting that data or whatever. So along those lines.
Correct. And, and kind of simple answer. And obviously, I think that there are probably not very many organizations that don't have, a California residence data. But, really that could be the simplest, example of it is, look through and see, do you actually have any, data that's actually subject to this act?
Right.
I'm guessing, there will be very few and far between the organizations that don't. But really understanding that, or if it's GDPR, understanding, do you actually have any in-scope data? And if you don't, then that's a decision. It's what to do from a flow chart standpoint.
Right.
But understanding what applies, and then where that data is, and then you can start to think about the controls that are around it.
Right. Right. Okay, that's good. And that right there, they're on their way to becoming, the quote, not expert, but they're aware now of where they really are.
Right, because it's like, I'm of a certain age that, I grew up watching G.I. Joe, and knowing is half the battle. And
There you go, exactly.
Because again, it's just, that's just the first step is,
Right.
understanding what the problem is, what the challenges are, what the situation is, so that you can then, start to build a program or build a plan or build a roadmap or whatever it may be.
Okay, right.
A little different subject, since we're talking about privacy versus and security. What typically we see, I guess you probably see the same, privacy and security split out into two different departments. What conversations do those departments need to have to bring what they're both trying to accomplish together for the common goal? How do they integrate those?
So that's kind of a loaded question, right? Just because it depends on the organization. And it's going to look really different, at a multinational with, tens of thousands of employees than it may look at, a small organization with a couple hundred employees. And so I think that, whatever it is that if there's something that affects both security and privacy, and they're broken out as departments or functions, there needs to be somebody accountable for that regulation or standard or whatever it may be, who then needs to kind of convene a meeting to decide who is responsible for what and where those responsibilities lie. HIPAA is a really good example of it. Is that, a lot of, small organizations that have HIPAA requirements, what I'll see is either the stuff that's done by technical people is done really well, and the stuff that, is usually done by attorneys is not, or all the legal stuff is done really well, but a lot of the technical stuff may not be assigned and done as well. So it's really making sure that you're able to, take all those things and put a plan together, have somebody responsible or some group responsible for, becoming compliant or meeting the compliance requirement or whatever it may be. And then from there, being accountable to, assign things or make sure people are aware of their responsibilities.
Right. And then another question is, what are some of the most common or most prevalent mistakes you see organizations make as far as demonstrating their compliance?
So that's another tough question, only because it really depends on the organization. But really, a lot of it comes down to documenting. There's a lot of times that, you'll see a program that may run very well. It may, in practice, be doing what it's supposed to, but those things aren't documented. So things like change management are not documented appropriately or whatever it may be. That's pretty common. Another one is, thinking that because you have documentation in place or policies and procedure in place, that those are actually being followed. Because again, you can have the best program on paper in the world, but if you're not following it, then it's kind of all for naught, and it's something that you're not going to be able to implement. So it's really just making sure that you're constantly thinking of ways that you can ensure that you're able to demonstrate that compliance. That whatever you're doing, you're documenting it and recording it in such a way, that you're able to show it.
I guess another piece of that is coming up with standard policies and procedures. We'll just take an employee leaving the company, for example, coming up with a standard policy. All right, you do A, B, and C to decommission their account.
Absolutely, and that's one of those things. I'm not very fun at parties, but I can talk about documentation all day. And it comes down to, what does your document taxonomy look like? And, for some organizations, they like to have a lot of specific information in their policies from a technical standpoint. Other organizations, one of the reasons being that policies can be much harder to get approved in an organization than a SOP or a standard or a procedure. And so they'll want to have their policy be as simple as possible, and kind of have broad statements and then reference, the standard. But regardless, if you're talking about, somebody, separating from the company, whether for calls or voluntarily or whatever it is, but just making sure that you have a process, that, matches up with the onboarding process, so that, throughout the employee life cycle, what access do they have, what do they have, so that when they separate from the company, you're able to, revoke all that and kind of follow the process in reverse. But really, it's policies are so important. I know that not everyone enjoys documentation, but it's one of those things that, I honestly believe people want to do the right thing. And so if you can define what the right thing is and what's expected, you can get a lot of, people to kind of get on board. The other thing is that when you have good policies, you can help people that aren't malicious. Because a lot of what you see, right, when there are mistakes or, data shared inappropriately, it's not usually malice. It's usually somebody trying to do their job better or more effectively, or they just didn't know. It's a lot more rare to see somebody being malicious. But if you can have really good standards and technologies and things in place to help the honest people who are just doing their job, then it makes it much easier to keep an eye out for anybody being malicious, in my view.
Right. And I can't agree more what you said about, people, they really want to do right. They may not know or may not have the policy in front of them. And sometimes I've seen also, if once you explain the buy-in, though, what's in it for us and the reward on it, you get their buy-in and you can kind of move forward with that. Then they're your biggest ambassadors right there. We do this because this, and everybody's on board at that point.
I'm right with you. And I've seen that time and time again. If the old example used to be, email, like personal email on computers. And it's funny because I sometimes tell younger people that used to be an issue on whether or not you're allowed to use personal email on your computer, because now everyone's got a phone, right? But 10 or 15 years ago, it was an issue because people wanted to be able to check their personal mail at work, and and nobody, and when you would outlaw that, or say they couldn't do it, people just always assumed it was an HR issue. It was somebody trying to make sure I wasn't spending my time reading email. But once it was explained to them, the actual risk of it and what could happen, and having some anecdotes around that, you would see people that would be much more amenable to the restriction. And so when people understand why you're putting a control in place, or how it protects data, or how it protects the customer data, or even employees, or whatever it is, people tend to follow it much better.
Right.
I'm a big proponent of that. I like to tell people why. It's not just do this; it's do this because, and here's my rationale. And obviously, of course, listening to what I have to say about it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I find that when I explain the why, you tend to get a lot more compliance.
Yeah, we just saw that recently with someone trying to get them to quit sharing passwords. And they're like, why do I care? I have nothing to hide. And so I said it to them this way: all right, something happens with your account. How can you, I'm coming to you to say you did this. I don't know who else knows your password. You're the one responsible.
Right.
And then once we've caught someone using their computer, looking at nefarious websites, they got the point.
So it's exactly. Again, and I've seen that time and time again. When you explain to somebody why, that you want them to do it a certain way, you tend to get a lot more, cooperation.
Right. I don't have any other questions.
Yeah, I think that was it.
I guess if you could tell us about, if anyone's interested in finding more about you, TrustedSec, where they could find that.
So again, if you ever want to talk to us, we're pretty easy to find on the internet. If you go on your favorite search engine and type in TrustedSec, TrustedSec, or go right to the source, TrustedSec.com. We're pretty active. A lot of us are pretty active on Twitter and other social media. But we have a lot of resources out there. Not just from a services perspective. Obviously, we would love to work with everybody. But if not, it's not something that, we have a lot of resources on our website, a lot of, free webinars, and a lot of the tools.
Podcast is another great resource.
Dave puts out a lot of stuff, a lot of open source stuff that's available on our site. So we're always happy to have people come out and check that out and look into it and learn more about the company. So, and the other thing is, we're always happy to answer questions. I always tell people you're free to reach out to me, and if I can answer a question for you, I'm happy to do it to the best of my ability. I won't try to sell you anything. So,
well, thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, we really
appreciate it. I appreciate it.